sexual sins. Therefore, what's likely to be happening here is that Ezekiel is reading the Sodom episode in light of the Levitical proscriptions or something like them. And of course, the Levitical proscriptions are absolute. They don't only apply to coercive acts of intercourse. So you have one more example of what clues do we have about how to read the Sodom story. We also, of course, have Genesis 2, which is within the sphere of material by the Yahwist, if you apply the literary critical theories that some do. What is Genesis 2 about? Genesis 2 is about the splitting of a binary or sexually undifferentiated human being into what? Male and female. Not male and male, not female and female. What that means is the one critical element about the splitting is the sex or gender, into which the sexually undifferentiated Adam or earthling or human being has been separated. And what that means is marriage is not just an intimate, lifelong union. It's also an intimate relationship between two complementary sexual others. That's what that story is telling us. The one critical dimension is the sexual differentiation that takes place, which then occurs in a remerger with marriage. You cannot merge two non-complementary sexual sames. In this story, you need a different kind of creation story, the kind of creation story, for example, spun by Aristophanes in Plato's Symposium, where he talks about three original human beings, a male-male, a female-female, and a male-female. Each of them are split, and thereafter, whichever one you're descended from, you long for that other half. That's a story that accounts for the appearance of homoerotic desire as an innate, almost congenital and genetic occurrence, if you will, already at this early stage in Plato's Symposium. That is not the kind of story, of course, that we find in Genesis 2. And then beyond all those stories, if we're still looking for more evidence about what Sodom meant, we need only to go to ancient Near Eastern texts generally as well, which find a problem, many of which find a problem not just with rape, same-sex rape, but also a willingness, when even more so when a person willingly desires to blur their gender identity, if you will, by having sex with somebody of the same sex, particularly as a passive homosexual partner, which compromises their masculine identity. So clearly they're not only concerned about rape, so what we'd have to argue is that the author of Genesis, the Genesis story about Sodom, is actually more favorably disposed towards same-sex intercourse than the larger ancient Near Eastern environment. In fact, it's quite the reverse. And then finally, we have the story, the parallel story of the Levite at Gibeah in Judges 19, which it reads almost like a carbon copy of the Sodom story. Now, what possibly could have been the view of the Deuteronomistic historian here, who is viewed as the author of the material from Judges, from Joshua through 2 Kings, on this matter? Well, there's a whole series of texts there about homosexual cult prostitution, in which the very negative terms it's described as. And we know in the ancient Near East that homosexual cult activity was actually regarded as the least offensive form of same-sex activity, at least so far as passive partners are concerned. Not the best, not the worst, rather, of same-sex intercourse, but the best. Because it was regarded that these participants, at least, were under the spiritual control of the goddess and couldn't do much about it. So that when the Deuteronomistic historian rejects that, he's rejecting the best in his cultural environment, not the worst. And even somebody like Phyllis Bird, an Old Testament scholar who has probably done as much work on this subject as anybody else, and is very much on the side of the pro-homosex lobby, even she argues that what the Deuteronomistic historian finds most offensive about the Kadashim, the homosexual cult prostitutes, is not the exchange of money, is not the cultic activity, but the repugnance for the homoerotic associations. Now, if that's the case, then obviously this author would have read this story in Judges 19 as primarily being problematic, not just simply because of the coercive element, but because of the same-sex intercourse per se. It's another example of how to read a parallel to the Sodom story. What do we ask? What alternate evidence do we have for suggesting that that story would have nothing to do with same-sex intercourse per se. What alternate historical evidence do we have? None. So what we're trying to do here is see an integrated web within Scripture. There's an ideological connection between the Ham story and the Sodom story and those stories and the Levitical text. There's connection between the Ezekiel text and the Levitical text and the Sodom text. There's connections between the Deuteronomistic historian and the text of Sodom, about Sodom by the Yahwist. And then, too, we didn't even discuss usage of these texts in early Judaism and in early Christianity, which likewise see same-sex intercourse per se as the primary problem. So all the evidence leads in one direction. Now I'm going to deviate over to this main issue that he gives about arguing, in fact, that same-sex intercourse, while prohibited in Scripture, is only prohibited for the cases which they know. This is the unique approach that Powell gives in his article. He essentially agrees that the biblical prescriptions against same-sex intercourse are universal, are unqualified, and absolute. And almost all the arguments that he gives there are arguments already appearing in my book, and I read them and I say, agree with that 100%. But then he deviates from that to argue, but it's only unqualified and absolute for the circumstances of which they are aware. And that would leave the possibility for exceptions, you see. That's what I'm going to argue and debate here. One little brief note before I do that. His little biblical overview of sexuality. By the way, again, I have high respect and high esteem for Dr. Powell and for his work generally. But I do disagree with the conclusions he's reached in this article. He is, again, however, more balanced than many from the other side. His biblical overview of sexuality. For him, the gift of sexuality is about three things. Procreation, normally. He has to say normally for the obvious reasons here. Number two, fostering a durable bond of intimacy. And number three, pleasure. Now, if that were all that sex is about, then a case for some forms of same-sex intercourse might be possible. In fact, a case for some forms of incest would be possible, though only with the qualification normally for procreation. But sex is also about interacting with a complementary sexual other. It's about learning to respond to another who is sufficiently and unlike, not just as an individual, but as a gender category. A process that in turn helps us to become Christ-like. Now, when you got married, you may not have been thinking, gee, I can hardly wait to learn what it's like to relate to a sexual other. Men probably, speak just for the men here now momentarily, pardon me, women for doing this, but I'm a man, and probably know a little bit about how men think. Significant amount about what you were thinking on your wedding night had very little to do with integrating with a complementary sexual other than having sex. Of course, you want to get to know your wife holistically and so forth, but most of us find when we get... Well, sometimes I have to put it out there. I go out on a limb and I say, men and women are different, okay? I'm just going to go out there on a limb. It's true. You know how I know that? Somebody once came to me shortly after they had been married, and he said, you know, yesterday I washed and waxed the floor for my wife, and then we had a great night that evening. Help me out here. What's the connection? Fortunately, I'd been married for some time by that point, and so I had some inkling, but otherwise would have had none, because I love my wife, but she could wash and wax the floors until the cow comes home, and it's not going to make any difference to me as far as sexual stimulation is concerned. She simply needs to put on the appropriate outfit, or lack thereof, and I'll be happy. My wife, by the way, is attractive, so I have no problems with that. It was quite clear what the issue was. Obviously, the wife was not sexually stimulated from Johnson floor wax. There's nothing to that, per se. But it was over the expression of care and concern for her needs and the work that she has to do. It's an example of how men and women are a little bit different. You get exceptions.